year. Entire industries would feel the shock. And unlike a financial crisis, this wouldn't be something governments could simply print money to fix. You can't stimulus your way around a broken supply chain when the source itself is cut off. This is where the United States enters the equation more directly. Washington would be under immense pressure to act, not just from Taiwan, but from allies and from its own economy. Allowing a blockade to stand would signal that force works, that economic strangulation is an acceptable tool for rewriting borders. That precedent would echo far beyond Asia. The first response would likely be measured. Diplomatic pressure, emergency summits, sanctions, public warnings. But behind the scenes, navies would move. Allied warships would begin escorting commercial vessels bound for Taiwan, testing the blockade without openly challenging it. Each escort would be a gamble. If China allows passage, the blockade weakens. If it stops or attacks those ships, the crisis explodes. At the same time, another option looms, darker and more dangerous. A counter-blockade. China's economy depends on the sea even more than Taiwan's does. Vast amounts of its energy, food, and raw materials flow through narrow maritime chokepoints. The South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca, routes watched closely by American and Allied forces for decades. In a conflict, those same routes could become pressure points. A US-led effort to restrict China's access to global trade wouldn't require invading Chinese territory. It would simply close the valves that keep the economy running. The consequences would be severe. Factories would stall, exports would collapse, financial markets would panic, social stability, something Beijing prizes above all else, would come under strain. Even with years of preparation, alternative routes, and expanded domestic energy production, China remains deeply exposed to maritime disruption. A sustained counter-blockade could shrink its economy dramatically in a matter of months. This mutual vulnerability is what makes the situation so dangerous. Both sides possess tools capable of inflicting catastrophic damage without firing a nuclear weapon. And yet, the more those tools are used, the harder it becomes to stop. Each escalation justifies the next. Each act of pressure creates incentives to double down rather than back off. This is the heart of the US strategy. Deterrence through denial and punishment. Deny China an easy victory by making Taiwan resilient and costly to seize. Punish aggression by threatening consequences so severe that victory feels hollow. The balance has to be precise. Too weak, and China pushes forward. Too strong, and Beijing may feel cornered, with nothing left to lose. Strategists call this the Goldilocks problem. The punishment has to be just right. Enough to force restraint, not enough to trigger desperation. Because desperation, in a world where both sides command nuclear arsenals, is the most dangerous force of all. China's leadership understands what failure over Taiwan would mean. It wouldn't just be a military setback. It would be a political earthquake. The legitimacy of the ruling party, the image of strength carefully cultivated for decades, would crack. For leaders who tie their authority to national destiny, backing down isn't just humiliating. It's existential. That's what makes a prolonged conflict so terrifying. Even if China were losing, even if the costs were spiraling, the incentive might be to keep going, to endure the pain rather than accept defeat. And from thousands of miles away, the United States would face its own constraints. Public opinion, political will, the sheer challenge of sustaining a massive military effort in China's backyard. This is no longer just about Taiwan. It's about whether any side can step back once the machinery of escalation is fully in motion. And that question has no reassuring answer. At this stage, the conflict would no longer belong to generals alone. It would belong to markets, governments, and ordinary people who suddenly find their lives reshaped by a crisis unfolding thousands of miles away. Every additional day of tension would harden positions, narrow options, and increase the risk that someone, somewhere, decides. Restraint is weakness. If the blockade drags on, the global economy begins to fracture in ways no modern society is prepared for. Supply chains that took decades to build don't bend gracefully. They snap. Entire industries would stall, not because of lack of demand, but because a single missing component can shut down an entire production line. Inflation would surge, unemployment would rise, governments would scramble to stabilize markets while quietly preparing for a future that looks nothing like the one they planned for. For Taiwan, the pressure would be relentless. Daily life would shrink, energy would be rationed, non-essential industry would shut down. The psychological toll would be immense. Living under the constant threat of escalation, never knowing whether today is the day the blockade turns kinetic, wears down even the most resilient societies. This is precisely what the strategy is designed to achieve. Victory without invasion, submission without a single boot on the ground. But there is a line that, once crossed, changes everything. A missile strike on a port, a ship sunk during an escort mission, a misidentified target in crowded waters. The moment the blockade becomes openly violent, the argument that this is anything other than war collapses. And with it, the last barriers to full-scale military intervention. At that point, punishment is no longer theoretical. It becomes immediate and devastating. Precision strikes on military infrastructure. Cyber operations aimed at blinding command networks. Sanctions that freeze assets, sever financial connections, and isolate China from the global economic system it helped build. Trillions of dollars in value could evaporate almost overnight. The damage would be historic, rivaling or exceeding the worst financial crises in modern memory. Yet even then, there are no guarantees of a clean ending. Sanctions and blockades take time to bite. Populations suffer before governments yield. Leaders faced with the choice between humiliation and prolonged hardship often choose hardship. This is the grim logic of great power conflict. Rational calculations give way to pride, fear, and survival. The United States knows this. That's why its strategy isn't about crushing China outright. It's about shaping the conflict's end before it begins. Offering Beijing a way to step back without collapsing domestically. A way to claim something that looks like success, even if the reality is far less impressive. A Pyrrhic outcome, high cost, limited gain, and no clear path forward. In that scenario, Taiwan remains free but battered. China emerges weakened, its ambitions checked, its economy scarred. The global system absorbs the shock but avoids total collapse. No one celebrates, everyone pays a price, and that, paradoxically, is what success would look like. Because the alternative is far worse. A grinding, multi-year conflict that bleeds economies dry, shatters alliances, and steadily erodes the barriers preventing nuclear escalation. Once great powers convince themselves they can outlast each other, restraint becomes a liability. And history offers no comfort about where that road leads. For now, the standoff continues. Pressure builds, signals are sent and interpreted, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. Taiwan grows more assertive, China grows more impatient. The United States walks a narrowing path between deterrence and provocation. Each side believes it understands the other. Each side could be wrong. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous. Not the weapons, not the ships, not even the missiles. It's the uncertainty, the belief that control can be maintained, that escalation can be managed, that a war can be shaped once it begins. Because once the first irreversible step is taken, the world may discover that this was the last chance to turn back. If you're listening to this on Global Focus, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next as this story continues to unfold. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from, because this isn't just one region's crisis anymore. And stay close, because more Global Focus stories are coming, and the next one may arrive sooner than anyone expects.